Again, good afternoon. Please be seated so that I may start. Today's lecture is on Edward Said's Orientalism. And we are nearing the end of the semester, so I think you'll be reading only one more or two more beyond this text. Okay, so you have a fly sheet in your hands, or a handout as it's also called. Make sure to go through it, because I'll be going through it almost religiously, so therefore there's no reason to be lost. Okay, and I will be referring to the Roman numerals as I go along. This way you'll know exactly where I'm at during my own lecture. So it's a relatively detailed outline, as you can see, and I will be talking also about some paintings or also included in your reading packet. So first, who is Edward Said? A classical pianist, an opera lover, a member of the Palestinian National Council between 1977 and 1991, a courageous defender of Palestinian human and political rights, a public figure with countless TV appearances, a much sought after professor, a critic of literature, history, philosophy, the media, culture, music, the arts, and politics, a husband to a Lebanese woman, Mrs. Mariam Qortas, a father of two now grown-up children, and fortunately, my PhD thesis advisor when I was a graduate student at Columbia University in the mid-1990s. So, having said all of that, clearly Edward Wadi' Said, and this would be his triple name, was truly what we might call a Renaissance man. Controversial in his multifaceted work, Said had both admirers as well as detractors, if not downright political enemies. Those who loved him almost worshipped him, and those who hated him issued literally death threats and called him a professor of terror. I was at Columbia at the time, and one of the students, I suppose, who belonged to the Zionist lobby actually put a sticky note, post-it note on his door, calling him a professor of terror. He was also maligned in a magazine called Commentary because he was once photographed in southern Lebanon, بالناورة, throwing a stone at an Israeli guardhouse. It made all the front pages of newspapers around the world. Although he explained later during an interview that his gesture was purely symbolic, and that he had not aimed the stone toward any particular individual, but against the occupying regime as such. Columbia University, which you might know is in New York City, is where he worked all his life, and he never bothered to take many other offers that came his way, including one from Harvard University. He loved the cosmopolitanism and the thriving cultural scene of New York City, calling Cambridge in Massachusetts, where Harvard is located, and which was trying to poach him from Columbia, a little village, and conservative little village at that in comparison. So a little bit more about his background, about his family, and his roots. Said was born to a wealthy Protestant family in Jerusalem on November 1 in 1935, when Palestine was still under the British mandate, as you might know. He spent much of his childhood, along with his four younger sisters, in Cairo, Egypt, sometimes traveling to Jerusalem to spend time with relatives, or to Beirut, Lebanon, and sometimes also, especially to Dhur al-Shwer, during summer vacations. At the age of 14, he moved with his parents to the United States, New York, where he obtained his BA from Princeton University in '57 and his PhD from Harvard University in '64. In '77, Said became a member of the PNC, or the Palestinian National Council, a provisional parliament established with the goal of pursuing eventual Palestinian nationhood. In the early 1990s, he was diagnosed with chronic leukemia, which he battled for 13 years before succumbing to his illness on September 25 in 2003 at the age of 68 in his own apartment in Manhattan. It was a stone throw from Columbia University, which he loved so much, and he is buried in Brummana, Lebanon. Works and legacy. Edward Said has written, needless to say, hundreds of articles on various subjects and has authored or occasionally co-authored well over 20 books. Some of which were actually published posthumously, which means after he passed away. He has written on different subjects. I'll give you an idea. His early book, which was based on his actual PhD from Harvard, is called Joseph Conrad and the Fiction of Autobiography. followed by our seminal work, Orientalism, which is published in 1978. It's the major work that launched him really to fame, so to speak. The Critic, The World, the Text, and the Critic, another book called Beginnings, a political book called After the Last Sky, Palestinian Lives, The Question of Palestine, Musical Elaborations, Culture and Imperialism, The Politics of Dispossession, Representations of the Intellectual, Covering Islam, How the Media and the Experts Determine How We See the Rest of the World is the subtitle, and so on and so forth. This is just a sample. Among the literary awards he received in his last years was one for lifetime achievement, which he certainly and fully deserved. They do that also at the Oscars, you may know that, but this is, of course, the Academy. Not the Oscars Academy, this is the actual Academy. And also, this was bestowed upon him actually in 2001, which means 2 years before he passed away in 2003. Also, if you are interested in further exploring the intricacies and the contradictions of his extremely colorful and eventful and productive life, I truly recommend that you read his autobiography, which he penned as a memoir titled Out of Place, and it was published in 1999. Out of Place, it has been translated into a zillion languages. I'm exaggerating, of course. And in Arabic, I think it's called Kharij al-Makan. It will tell you much more about Edward Said, the man, and not just Edward Said, the scholar. Also, there's a very interesting documentary, which is 138 minutes long, also titled Out of Place, Memories of Edward Said, and it was directed by the Japanese filmmaker Sato Makoto, and it was released in 2006. I don't know if you can watch it on YouTube, or you can certainly look it up. It was filmed in Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, Egypt, and the United States, and it traces Said's childhood influences and celebrates his intellectual legacy. For the most up-to-date information on this legend of a man, many recent books have come out. I mean, my information goes to 2011. I'm sure if you put in his word in either Amazon or Google Scholar or even just plain Google as a search term, you're going to come across many new readers, that have come out in the last several years that tell you more about him. Essays about him, but also essays by him, not to mention, of course, all the books and articles he has written. So, before we talk about Orientalism today, what it means, what in theory, but also what it means in practice, and what it means epistemologically, aesthetically, and politically, and what it, and why it was coined in the first place, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some major literary historical events that led basically to his book, that made him write his book in the first place, so to speak. So what was happening in the 18th century, which is really the beginning of modernity, if you like to think about. Some people like to think of Romanticism as the beginning of modernity, but the age of Enlightenment is, of course, really where modernity began, with people like Montesquieu and Voltaire and many others, of course, out of England. David Hume and John Locke, and many of whom you read in CVSP 203. This is when basically religion was divorced from morality once and for all, the complete separation between state and church. So this is really where the roots of modernity begin. So what was happening there as far as the East is concerned, or rather the perception of the East by the West, that made him finally basically decide that this was enough of a critical mass movement to be actually called by a term, namely Orientalism. I would like to mention a few events. I'm now under Roman numeral 3. One of them is the 1001 Nights, or Alf Layla wa Layla, as we call them, Les Mille et une Nuits in French. Now, what happened? What happened was that a man by the name of Antoine Galland, who spoke Arabic fluently, or at least who read Arabic fluently, came to this part of the world, came to Lebanon, spent time especially with Maronite monks at the beginning of the 18th century. And his job, one of many, was basically to try to compile the 1001 Nights, Alf Layla wa Layla. And the origins of these scattered tales were, first of all, they were oral in nature before they were written down. So his job was not to write them down, but to compile them and later translate them into French. And the origins of these tales, as you may know, are both Arabic, Indian, and Persian. So that's why a lot of these stories take place either in Arab lands, also in India, but also further east. So you might say, why is this important? It is very important because that translation into French between 1704 and 1717, by the way, and it was, I think, 12 volumes in total. It was a very sanitized version, by the way, because the original Arabian Nights are very pornographic in nature. If you read the original Arabian Nights, you know, you'd be surprised by how much the secular imagination fired up, you know, in the East centuries earlier. So he delivered a very sanitized, sort of like palatable to the bourgeois taste in French. And after that, basically, things just skyrocketed. It started being translated into every single European vernacular that you can think of. And suddenly, the West became aware of something called the East, lying to the east of it, but also to the south of it. When I say the Orient, by the way, not when I say the Orient, when Edward Said says the word Orient, he doesn't only mean the Near East, which is where we are, or the Levant, or even the Far East, or you know, or what we call Asia Minor, or West Asia, which is where we are. The East or the Orient is more of it's a lumping term that also includes Africa. So basically, it includes all that which lies to the south and to the east of Europe, and which is not European, not Christian, not bourgeois, not white, not middle class, not Christian, and all of those different things. So the second major event was the discovery of Sanskrit, Lugha Sanskritiyya, by a man called William Jones, and that was done in Bengal, in India, in 1786. So this came after the translation of the Arabian Nights. Again, you might ask me, why is it so important? Why is, you know, Dr. Hout even bothering to mention that? It is important because until then, until the last quarter of the 18th century, Western intellectuals and critics and scholars basically operated on the false assumption, which they mistook as fact, that the origins of all humanity, you know, begin with one language, and that is, you know, the Hebrew language, and that the Judeo-Christian tradition is the oldest of all cultural and historical and religious traditions. Sanskrit came to show that Aramaic is later, that actually Hebrew is not the oldest language in the world. So all of a sudden, you have to imagine the emotional and intellectual repercussions of such a discovery. All of a sudden, when they had looked to this part of the world, to the Holy Land, you know, the land of the Canaanites, you know, and who coexisted with the Hebraic people, and so on and so forth, as the locus of all civilizational progress, all of a sudden they had to turn their eyes further east to even earlier and more ancient civilizations that predate, of course, the monotheistic traditions. And Sanskrit is an older language than Hebrew. So that shifted the entire, if you like, locus of control, or it even caused shockwaves through some of those circles. I would also like to mention that until the middle of the 18th century, most people who called themselves Orientalists were really only scholars of the Bible and scholars of the Quran, students of Semitic languages. As you know, Arabic and Hebrew are both Semitic languages. Also, they studied Arabic languages, but very few of them had actually devoted their time and energy to texts, to fictional texts. So after those two major discoveries, Bengal and the Arabian Nights, many more started investing a lot of, if you like, energy and time into the fictional aspect, the fictional treasures, and not only the languages of the religions and of the you know, textbooks as such. In 1832, the term Oriental Renaissance was coined by a Frenchman called Edgar Quinet. I mention it because it's interesting, because most of you, when you hear the word Renaissance, you think of the European Renaissance. Of course, we also have the Arab Renaissance, or what we call Al-Nahda. But this is neither the Arabic Nahda, nor is it the European Renaissance. This is the Oriental Renaissance, okay? Which basically means the onset of European obsession, fantasies, scholarly interest, colonial conquest of all that lies to the east and south of Europe, as I said, because Orient is a lumping term. So now we come to the book, Orientalism. Nothing comes from nothing. And even, as we say, giants stand on the shoulders of others, right? And so Edward Said must have been indebted to somebody, intellectually speaking. Who were the major forces? Who were the major thinkers, philosophers, critics, who influenced him a great deal and shaped him, if you like, theoretically, or primed him theoretically to basically define Orientalism as a discourse and which I'll talk about in a minute, the way he did. So who were those two major thinkers? I'm going to mention only two because they are the two most important ones. These are the ones who influenced really the conception of the book as a discourse. One of them is the French philosopher Michel Foucault, and the second one I will talk about a little bit is the Italian political theorist by the name of Antonio Gramsci. Okay, so first, Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault was a 20th century French philosopher, and basically what Edward Said, he was extremely influenced by him, by the way, and he also, was the first to coin the term discourse. Basically, what Foucault believed was that politics is never innocent. There's no such innocent thing related or coming near the word politics. He also very much believed that there's a very strong relationship between power and knowledge. Now, Francis Bacon had said that already during the European Renaissance. He had said that knowledge is power, right? Al-ilmu silah, as we say. Knowledge is power. That is correct. But what is more important here is to believe that knowledge leads to more power. And when you have more power over something that you're studying, you will also yield a greater knowledge. So it's basically what we call the snowball effect. The more power you have over something, the more you can study it, and the more you can produce knowledge. And the more knowledge you have, the more you can control it, and again, exercise power over it. This is what he took over, basically, from Michel Foucault. Okay. Now, the work of Antonio Gramsci also was influential because Gramsci had talked a lot about the concept of hegemony. Hegemony is called al-haymana in Arabic, and not a word passes without hearing this word on the news, on television, okay, or even on the social media. So, and basically, of course, what he believes is that the West exercised complete hegemony in thought, in action, in emotion, in lifestyle over the East, which is, again, what Orientalism is all about. Okay, so I would like also to mention, sort of on the margins, that the word the other is no longer a buzzword, but really was about 20, 25 years ago. Even if you look up the verb to other, you can now find it as a verb in the Oxford and Cambridge English dictionaries, which you didn't necessarily do earlier. To other someone means to emphasize the differences that separate you from someone, to exoticize someone, to be by far more interested in what separates you rather than what brings you together. So it became such a popular term that, for example, Youssef Chahine, the famous Egyptian filmmaker, actually of Lebanese extraction, made a movie called Al-Akhar, which is the other in Arabic, that was released in 1999. Just to show you that it also made it very much into the Arabic language as al-akhariya. Al-akhariya means the otherness, okay? So these are words that have crept into our languages, the Arabic language, from the English, but even they did not exist in English with the same connotations and with the same lexical and grammatical flexibilities that they do now. So, we've talked a little bit about his intellectual inheritance. Now let's move on to his intellectual progeny. Progeny is that which comes after you, posterity. So, what did Orientalism really achieve, and what does it do as a book, and why are you even reading it in CVSP 204? Orientalism has been extremely influential, also controversial, in post-colonial studies, what we call post-colonial studies today. And really, it inaugurated the field in 1978. So there was no such thing as post-colonial studies or post-colonial theory before this book. It was groundbreaking as such. And I'll give you an example. Two critics, doesn't matter who they are, basically described the book as such. They saw it as a textbook. They saw it as a manual, you know, like a to-do manual in the following sense. They said, quote, Native Americans, Africans, Asians, Latin Americans, and other colonized peoples and oppressed groups located in this book called Orientalism. What they located was a method to challenge a chronic tendency of the West to dominate, to deny, to suppress, and to distort their own cultures and histories, end of quote. So in other words, many other peoples who may not have been described as much or been involved as much in his book, who might have even come from other continents, also saw in this book sort of a lot of inspiration. It's been translated into many, many, many languages, including Arabic, of course, and it's called Al-Istishraq in Arabic, in case you are curious. Okay, so Said explained once why he conceived of Orientalism when he actually did, which is obviously prior to 1978. And he said that this happened to him in the wake of the 1967 war. I don't know how much this generation knows about Harb al-Naksa. Does anyone know anything about Harb al-Naksa, 1967? What happened? Yes. And Egypt was dealt a tremendous blow by Israel, of course. And in fact, he tried to resign as a result of that. Jamal Abdel Nasser, that is. Okay, he tried to resign. It was a wake-up call for all Arabs at the time. It was seen as a major defeat. So he said that this event, Edward Said was living in the States at the time when it happened. Remember, he moved as a 14-year-old. He was already there. But he said that this event created an extremely strong anti-Arab sentiment in New York. Could you imagine what it was like in Iowa? Okay, so it was bad enough in New York, where you always find people who are like you. And it was only then, he said, that he came to both appreciate and defend his Arab identity in the American cultural and political context. And so Palestine, he says, which is where he grew up and was born, and by extension the Arab world, he said, transformed for him from a memory into a reality, even if he wasn't living there anymore, one which he felt needed to be embraced, illuminated, and fought for. Okay, it needed its defenders, and he came. And he rose to the occasion. As he explains, quote, much of the personal investment in Orientalism derives, he says, from my personal awareness of being myself an Oriental. As a child growing up in two British colonies, first Palestine and then Egypt. So, what does Said mean by the term? Why is Orientalism a discourse? First of all, its discursivity is signaled by its suffix. What is a suffix? The ISM at the end of the word, as opposed to a prefix, right? So anything that ends with ISM, when we say Marxism, when we say post-colonialism, when we say feminism, and you're reading Simone de Beauvoir, aren't you? These are all discourses. Does anyone know what the Arabic term is for that? What is the Arabic translation of the word discourse? It's called al-khitab. Not khitab as in khutbah, as in standing here and giving a lecture from a platform or a podium. No, it means khitab. And you hear this a lot on the Lebanese news. You say, khitab 14 azar, khitab 8 azar. That's exactly what it means. A discourse is a whole way of looking at the world and acting accordingly. It infiltrates every aspect of your life. It's not just ideological. It is a way of living, a certain ideology, and practicing it. Okay? So Orientalism, without a doubt, in his mind, is a discourse. It's not just a passing term. It's a discourse. And it's a discourse that began, according to Edward Said, in a very specific historical moment, and that is when Mr. Napoleon Bonaparte decided to drag armies of not only soldiers, and here's the kicker, but also scholars and painters and dancers and botanists and archaeologists and historians in his Napoleonic famous expedition to Egypt in 1798, 2 years before the turn of the 19th century, in order to do what? To colonize it. But again, here's the kicker. It was not just to colonize it with boots on the floor or boots on the ground. No, it was a whole way of dominating it, also culturally speaking, which is why after Orientalism came his book, I would say about 12 years later, called Culture and Imperialism. Culture is not innocent either, nor innocuous. Culture always has a political, if you like, downside to it, or underside to it. So, in other words, when Napoleon arrived with all these armies of scholars and painters, it was with the intent of exercising not only political, but also cultural, if not also linguistic hegemony. Okay? And here we're back to Michel Foucault's notion of power yields more control, and control yields more knowledge, and so on and so forth, back to the... And since then, according to Edward Said, we start seeing in literature the beginnings of what he calls essentialized and crude caricatures of Muslim Arabs, and that until now, really, you can see persisting in the media. I mean, yes, now there's more knowledge about who we are. Well, frankly, not things didn't go so well after 9/11, as I'm sure you know. Things might have changed a little bit after 2011, which came 10 years after the 9/11, the downing of the Twin Towers, and I'm talking about the Arab Spring, which came in 2011. That's 10 years. And maybe for some people, yes, Arabs, of course, rose to the occasion, and suddenly there was hope in the Arab world. But things didn't really change all that much, according to him. Now, every once in a while, you might come across a movie, maybe with George Clooney in it, because now he's married to an Arab woman, well, one of Arab extraction, where you might see really an attempt to actually have a dialogue with the Arab other. But in most other movies, you still see pretty much a lot of cliches hanging over any real encounters, if there are any real encounters with Arabs. They still tend to be shadowy and shady and seedy and backstabbing. And most of the depictions you see of the desert are still very cliched and so on and so forth. But I'll talk about this in a minute. So this deeply entrenched tradition of inaccurate images and statements, mostly about the Middle East and Asia and Western culture, has served as an implicit justification, this is important, for both European and American imperial projects in the region. You know, the white man's burden, how many of you have heard that? What is the white man's burden? You are white, which is, of course, seen as being already quite superior, and therefore you carry that burden of reaching out to the other, you know, possibly trying to missionarize them, bringing them into the fold, so to speak, and of course kicking the hell out of them if they don't comply, and of course rob the land, pillage and rape and you know, and loot, and of course that comes with the territory. But this is basically what Orientalism is. So and also another important point he makes is that the West came to know itself as the opposite of the East. So if the East is dirty, it's because Europe is clean. If the East is backwards, it's because Europe is politically democratic and progressive. Europe never really defined itself, according to Edward Said, until it came into this encounter with the East and came to define itself as that which the East is not. This is a very important notion. I would like to talk a little bit about, you read Nietzsche, right? You read Nietzsche, you read Beyond Good and Evil. Is that still the same text you are reading? Okay, great. So here you realize that Nietzsche is not far off. All of these readings are really related to one another, even if it doesn't seem so at first glance. Why so? What did Nietzsche argue? Nietzsche was first trying to argue against dichotomous thinking, if you remember that. According to him, all hell broke loose, all error began with Plato and his belief in the physical and the metaphysical world. And of course, Nietzsche only believes in this world, and there's only chaosmos, as you probably remember. So according to Nietzsche, therefore, the Western metaphysical tradition, or philosophical tradition, has always thought in binary terms, where one term is prioritized over and against the other, man over woman, mind over body. The afterlife is better than this life. Well, first of all, prove to me that there is an afterlife before you even claim that it is better. That's the double error, not just Plato's. But anyways, so basically, if you think of Nietzschean epistemology, you would realize that this is exactly what Orientalism is actually enacting, which is this continuation or perpetuation of epistemological dichotomous thinking. The West is superior to the East. Of course, the worst thing would be to be an Eastern woman. That's like a double whammy, because A, you're a woman, and B, you are Eastern. So you can start thinking and realizing that this is all based on very, of course, erroneous, hierarchical, epistemological thinking that has, of course, huge political and also humanistic repercussions. So this is where Nietzsche plays into the text. So also Freud plays into the text. Freud had said what? You read Freud, right? Civilization and its contents. And according to him, whether you believe him or not, we are born with two primal urges. One is called eros, the desire to be happy, the desire to be sexually satisfied, the desire to simply survive, because it's not just sexual, whatever, fantasies or life, it's everything. And then you have thanatos, the desire to aggress against others, but sometimes also even against oneself. So according to Edward Said, and he was, by the way, a big reader of Freud, I'm not sure a believer, but a reader of Freud, and he very much thought that Freud was to be detected in the mindset of all those Western scholars, travelers, fabulists, that came to the West. And I would like you to turn your attention, for example, to the painting that we have here. It is by obviously some Orientalist painter. I don't know what the name is. And there are thousands of them. If you, and I've given you a sample already in the handout, and there are like a million more. Of course, not all of them are good. Not all of them make it to big museums. Not all of them are by Delacroix and Jerome and others, but many are. Now, if you look at this painting, does it strike you as being in some way unrealistic? Okay, I'll continue. What do you see? How many characters do you see? 4, right? We have this man, half naked himself, lounging. He's obviously some kind of a chieftain who is waiting for the next slave, female slave, to be brought to him. And then he already has a mistress, probably his favorite one, lounging next to him. We have this old man who is obviously he's the one who's bringing the bargain, who's trying to seal the deal. And we have this woman who's very interestingly completely naked. And she is shying away from, today we would say from the camera, she is shying away from the painter. She does not want, if she cannot protect her body, she can at least protect her face. Yani, I find this, I don't know, very interesting. And of course it shows you how, now I'm not saying that that Arab societies were not slave societies. Of course they were. Don't ever delude yourself into thinking that they were not. Arabs traded with slaves. Of course, Islam tried to bring that to an end, as you know, but I mean, there was a lot of slavery still going on. Of course, the darker shades, the darker skin being the ones who were, this one, of course, is probably a war prize or something. But it shows you how the Western mind is very much interested in those. Now, this one is, I find even more interesting. This one takes place in the hammam. It is a Turkish bath, or I don't know, Arab bath, and of course only women are allowed. And again, you see a lot of nudity because, let's face it, this is a form of voyeurism. I mean, and there were 3 basic areas where especially Western male travelers could not go. One of them is the inside of a Turkish bath for women. Second, the Kaaba in Saudi Arabia, because if they are Christians, they are not allowed, men or women, they're not allowed to enter. And the desert. Many of them feared the desert, but loved to be in the desert. Those are the places that held the greatest fascination. The 4th one would be the Seraglio, which is called the Haramlik, which is where they thought, you know, well, sometimes truly so, where all the women that belong to a particular pasha are kept. These 4 spaces always fired up Western imagination, precisely because they don't exist in Europe. There's no desert, there are no Haramliks, there are very few baths, and finally, there is, I can't remember what the 4th one is. They don't exist in the European context. This one here, you have this, they have this black-clad person who's coming in with what looks like a hookah or a nargile for the women to enjoy while they are, of course, getting clean and socializing. It's a social space. And this is the full painting. It's not cropped. And the head is cut off, though. It's as if it is cropped, when in fact it's not. And what I find interesting in this painting, first of all, we don't know the gender or the sex of this person coming in. It could be a man, for all we know, veiling himself as a woman or covering himself as a woman. For all we know, it could be the alter ego of the painter himself. If he cannot actually go there with his feet, he can go there with his imagination. He can actually enter a forbidden space. He can look at all of these women. It is make-believe, but it is, again, to show you Edward Said's major point, which is that when many of these Westerners pretended to be reflecting the East, they were not reflecting the East. They were reflecting their own inner desires, their own fantasies, be they erotic or aggressive. And this is, of course, eroticism, although you can argue that it's also a form of, perhaps, aggression, because you are not actually trying to portray anything as it truly is. It's a form of intellectual aggression. But anyway, clad here, no pun intended, because everybody is nude, in the form of eroticism. So this is basically what's happening. This is where Freud creeps into this world, you know. And of course, all of these spaces I mentioned become collective areas, or literally spaces where the collective Western imagination can find outlet precisely because they can get away with it. The Maghreb, Morocco in particular, I can assure you, I've read enough travel accounts. It was a haven for white men to go and exercise homosexual acts when they were still frowned upon in Europe and in America, because they thought that, hey, we can get away with it, and Morocco is the place for us to find, you know, this kind of, pleasure. Okay, so we have a lot of images of sexual lasciviousness, excess, both hetero and homosexual desires playing themselves out. Okay, I don't know, are you still reading Gustav von Aschenbach, Death in Venice, or is that out? You're reading it. Okay, great. Well, then all I would like to say is that the Orient is Venice, okay? And I want you to think about those parallels, because the man went there in search of a surge of emotions that he felt and couldn't understand back in cold Munich. He goes there because he saw a tiger, or thought he saw a tiger, and then he goes there and he falls in love with this 14-year-old boy, and he discovers that he is latently, at least, homosexual, although there's no act of homosexuality. And the East, Venice is the East where the cholera breaks out and kills you. It's where the id rises at the expense of the ego and the superego. And hey, this is apparently what the East does too. You go there, but be careful, you might lose yourself there if you don't exercise your ratio, your reason, at some point in the game. So, to cut a long story short, the East is both a playground and it is also a battlefield. It's a battlefield when there are wars to be made, when there are conquests to be made, but it's also a playground for the imagination. Okay. The main actors, according to him, of Orientalism were the French and the British. And of course, after World War II and the defeat of Nazi Germany, it was the rise of the American Empire. Okay? So in short, in insisting not on seeing and constantly representing the Orient as it is, according to Edward Said, they insisted on replicating what they thought the Orient should be. So it is not an empirical tradition. It is not one based on actual experiences, even if they actually went there in body. In mind, they were still very much glued to their stereotypes that they arrived with, because their minds had been shot through with all of these cliches and stereotypes that it was very hard for most, if not all, to overcome, even during an actual encounter with the so-called Orient. Now, a lot of critics have taken issue with Edward Said on this, and they try to make differences between men and women who go there, and they try to make differences, but regardless. So, what is Orientalism now? And now I'm looking at D, letter D. Orientalism is a discourse, is a style of thought based on ontological and epistemological distinction made between the Orient and the Occident. It is also, according to him, a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. Okay, what is the structure of the Orientalist discourse? According to Edward Said, Orientalism is divided into three. This is very important. This is really the nuts and bolts of the text. Orientalism is divided into three mutually reinforcing components. One of them he calls academic Orientalism. The second he calls imaginative Orientalism. And the third he calls historical/material Orientalism. Academic Orientalism is easy. It's the easiest to define. Actually, 1 and 3 are easier than 2. 1 is simply, academic Orientalism. Anybody who comes from the West and tries to engage in any kind of an intellectual pursuit, whether it is a translation of the Quran, an exegesis of the Quran, what do I know, a sociologist, an anthropologist, somebody who studies even the temperatures of the desert, all of these are academic Orientalists, because they're dealing with some aspect of either the physical or the intellectual, face of the Orient. The historical material simply means boots on the ground, when they arrived with the desire to militarize and conquer and colonize. Or the imaginative this is the imaginative, okay? But it's not just paintings. So remember that a lot of people who actually, some of whom might have never left Europe, and we call them actually armchair travelers because they never left their armchair or their fauteuils. They still wrote fantastic tales about having been there, starting in the 18th century. We call them pseudo-Oriental tales, pseudo-voyages, but they were actually selling like hotcakes as well. So the main point is that these three branches of Orientalism mutually reinforce one another. Once the academics have more knowledge about the East, well, they are serving the colonialists, because with that knowledge, they can know where the villages are, and they can go and pillage better. And by the same token, the more information there is, the more there is for the fabulists to play with and distort and add color to and twist out of shape perhaps, and to produce more. And the same applies to music. I didn't talk about music so far, but a lot of people also were inspired by the East. Mozart, for example, 5 of his symphonies are inspired by Eastern music. Goethe, whom you read still, I don't know if you read him. If you read Faust, he also wrote the East-West Divan. I mean, just about everybody in his or her career wrote or produced or did something that had a direct bearing on or was directly inspired by either a direct encounter with the East or second-hand information about the East. So, second, Orientalism, he says, has two faces. One of them is latent. This is very important. Back to the nuts and bolts. And the second one is actually manifest. Again, Edward Said shows his indebtedness to Sigmund Freud, because Sigmund Freud had always used those two terms. Latent is that which lies at the bottom, which is infrastructural, hard to define, but yet defines you. Whereas manifest is that which simmers on the surface, but is actually defined by what lies underneath. And what lies underneath, of course, according to Edward Said, lurks in the unconscious, which can only be brought out by certain means and methods. But I'm not going to go there, like hypnosis and dream analysis and that. Okay, so how does this relate to Orientalism? Okay, according to Edward Said, when we look at this painting, and when we listen to, say, what do I know, The Abduction from the Serai by Mozart, and we read a boring letter, say, by Herbert Kitchener, who actually, colonized Egypt and the Sudan, and we look at them, they seem very different. What does a painting have to do with a boring letter written by a military officer to another, to a poem by Volney, for example, or Gautier, who was just sitting there and enjoying the colors of Istanbul? Edward Said would say, yeah, they look very different, agreed. And some of them might seem to be enamored with the East, but don't be fooled by the surface differences. These differences only lie on the surface. They're only manifest because they're determined by, not by intention, according to him, but they're determined by genre. If I'm writing a letter, I have to follow certain conventions. If I'm painting, I have to follow other painterly conventions. But they might seem very different on the surface. They might seem very much related to form and style, and therefore different. But according to him, if you dig deep enough, you will realize that they're all, one way or another, are based on the very assumption that the East is inferior to the West. And in fact, it is this very false belief of inequality and inequity that enables the very creative operation to begin with, that gives it even its license. Now, again, a lot of people have taken issue with Edward Said, but this is basically the difference between latent Orientalism, which is unchanging, it's like molasses, it moves very slowly, if at all, it's unconscious, and it dictates what is on the surface, which might fool you as being different from one person to another, from one Orientalist to another, but not him. It would not fool him. So, this is basically another important point. And another thing that is related to all of this is basically to reiterate his notion that, here's the thing, if you look at all of the products, be they paintings, be they symphonies, be they letters, be they poems, be they novels, that have been produced by Westerners as inspired by the East, he argues very vehemently and emphatically that the internal consistency of this corpus is much stronger than any correspondence between East and West. In other words, the consistency value is higher than the correspondence value, which means that, again, he insists on the notion that these Orientalists, that most of their products are very textual and very much reliant on intertextuality. They're very much reliant on citing one another in order to establish authority and in order to establish credibility. So, how does an individual author establish authority? He says there's a principle that he calls exteriority. The people who are producing these works about the East pretend to be outside of it and just presenting something that they have studied or looked at, although I'm arguing the exact opposite here. And therefore, they have this authority because they are objective. So there's this myth or fiction of objectivity when sometimes, in fact, there's nothing but subjectivity being involved. So this is what he calls strategic location. You as an author, as a producer, you pretend that you are outside of your subject matter to emphasize exteriority, even when none exists at times. The second point he called strategic formation, which is basically this consistency that I talked about earlier. They're much more obsessed with one another than they are at any time with the East. And nobody is really interested in reflecting the East as in reflecting on the East, to put it this way. So, the book is divided into 3 chapters. I will not rename them. There's the scope of Orientalism, there's Orientalist structures and restructures, and finally there's Orientalism now. The book has been received, as I told you, either with open arms or with complete criticism, but mostly positive, because it, as I said, it served as the inaugural text of post-colonial theory. Some people have taken issue with the fact that he doesn't talk a lot about women travelers, women writers from Europe, that he focused more on men, that he also did not very much take into consideration the element of class, because social class sometimes also determines your identity and not only your national one, and also that he did not talk about the others within Europe, because Europe has its own sort of underdogs, such as Wales and Scotland and Ireland, when he in fact only focused on the East. But hey, what can a man do in one lifetime, right? So I would like to end with one thing before I say goodbye to you. There are 3 questions that I think are mentioned at the end of your handout. What does representing another culture even mean today in the context of 21st century globalism? Think about that, in which the world is often described as a global village because of high-speed travel, mass migrations, and other forms of mobility. 2, in the age of the internet, social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, what does it even mean to have like a dialogue with someone else? Has that made things easier, or has that actually made things more difficult? Are those bringing people together, or are they driving them apart? Maybe it depends on the platform, it depends on the chat room, it depends on intentions and what have you. And finally, the 3rd point I would like to say, hypothetically, this is really a sort of a mind game more than anything else, but I think it's a very useful one. I think you should all engage in it, not just today or tomorrow, but like every once in a while. Hypothetically, if you had the chance as, to change who you are today and to step into the feet of someone else for only 24 hours, somebody that you consider on a good day your exact opposite, because of racial, because of economic, or because of whatever linguistic reasons, socioeconomic ones. The question is, for you then, would be, who would this person be? Even without leaving Lebanon, if you looked all around, which group or which person would you see as your exact opposite? And if you did manage to play this mind game, and imagine yourself to be in that man's shoes, and you have to walk 1,000 miles, remember? Don't judge a man until you've walked in his shoes for 1,000 miles. What would you learn more? Not only about him or her, but about yourself. And what would you change if you were to come back to who you are? Thank you very much.